Hello and thank you for joining us today. I'm Abby Teleria, coming to you live from Melissa Data's headquarters in Rancho Santa Margarita, California. Our webinar today is How to Mail to Your Best Customers at the Lowest Rate with Saturation Mail. Joining me is our resident mailing expert, Tony Deacon. He'll go over how to qualify for a saturation mailing and unlock the lowest price tiers using Mailers Plus 4, our easy-to-use postal automation software. But before we jump right in, I want to encourage everyone to submit questions. You can type those in at any time during the presentation and towards the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded, so if you miss anything or want to forward to someone, you'll be able to do so. All right, we have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Tony?
Thank you, Abby. Thank you all for attending today. As in the third part of our series of mailings, we're going to do saturation mail today. Previously, we discussed general mailing settings, and then we did destination discounts for additional discounts. And then this week, we're going to show the lowest tiers that you can get, so that the cheapest of all possible prices that you could get. Saturation or high density mailing is called that because you're basically saturating an individual carrier route within zip codes. Zip codes being divided up into carrier routes and the individual routes that the carriers walk when they deliver the mail. So saturating an entire route allows you to claim the lowest price tiers that the USPS has to offer. Generally speaking, this would be the most useful for businesses where their customers are local, where you're trying to get the local area, the customers around you, the houses, neighborhoods, that sort of thing. It's the cheapest rate that you can possibly claim, so you can get the most bang for the buck, so to speak, and you can send the most mail pieces per dollar to your potential customers. It's especially good for local businesses where you don't necessarily know who your customers are, they just have to be close enough to come in. Medical offices, retailers, restaurants, where the surrounding population can change at any time, but your location doesn't change. Obviously, saturation high-density mailings are the lowest tiers the USPS offers, which can be up to 70% less than consumer or business list per lead, as well as the lowest tiers for the postage itself, so you can reach the most potential customers for the lowest possible prices. For saturation high-density mailings, there are specific requirements, unlike the other standard mail, and generally it's the 90-75 rule, where if you're doing saturation, the mailing must include 75% of all deliveries in a given carrier route, or if it's residential only, then it has to be 90% of all available deliverable addresses. Without meeting these minimums, you can't claim that rate. In addition to having the 90-75 percentages, you also have to have walk sequence numbers in the file. There has to be a column for the walk sequence, and that follows the actual sequence that the carrier walks. Walk sequence numbers cannot be appended by any software on the market. You'd either have to purchase a list that's already in walk sequence list, or if your mailing list has enough pieces per carrier route, you can append those numbers using a service license to do that, and then you'll be able to walk sequence your own list. As we discussed in the previous webinar when we discussed destination discounts, the same destination discounts also apply to saturation. So while you're already claiming the lowest possible tiers by doing saturation, you can lower those prices even further still by adding the destinations in the same way that we went over in the previous webinar. As we did in the previous webinar, we discussed finding the destinations, and in our software Mailers Plus 4, you can use the quick tool Tally in order to find the destinations where you could qualify for the SEF, NDC, DDU discounts. Also, I wanted to point out in this webinar, you can use it, you can see carrier route as well as sectional center facility are highlighted, and so you can use this to tally then percentages of the carrier route within your list to see if you could qualify for appending the walk sequence numbers to make it into a saturation list. Here we've run a tally by carrier route, and you can see the percentages, the total number of deliveries in the route, 912 at the top one, and then this report shows you what percentage you have. So you can see some of the routes don't reach the 75 percentile requirement, but some are over 90 and even 100%. Those routes could qualify for walk sequencing and could then qualify for saturation rates. At Melissa Data, we have a data enhancement department that is certified to do that service. They can append the walk sequence numbers. When pre-sorting a file like this, you'd have to make sure that walk sequence is formatted as walk sequence, because that field is specifically what will cause it to be able to qualify for these rates. Without that formatted, the software would not even try for that rate, because it's a special category. And you can see once you've added that, then at the very top of the pre-sort suggested mailings will be the enhanced carrier route, walk sequence, high density, line of travel. Those categories would be the first ones it tries for, and would only go to lower categories if there were leftover pieces that hadn't qualified. So again, as the previous example, some of your routes could qualify for full saturation, where you might still have some routes where you don't. Referring again to our previous webinar, where we did the destination discounts, you can see there are saturation rates in both categories. So you can do saturation at 20.2 cents with no destination, but if you added the SCF as we discussed in the previous webinar, you could get it as low as 15.7 cents. So basically adding another piece per dollar that you could mail, getting it that much lower. So in all these saturation, high density plus categories, you can still use those additional discounts for the destinations added. Once you've done this in the software, you'll see it'll also create these are the tags for the mail containers, the tray tags. And you can see WSS is highlighted there, that's walk sequence saturation. The other one next to it is WSH in the same position, and that's walk sequence high density. So you can see once the pieces qualify for that, then it also makes the appropriate tags that claim that discount. A lot of people are now discussing Every Door Direct Mail, EDDM. That's a new promotion by the post office, though we don't know if it's permanent or just a temporary thing. It's a way for you to claim the saturation rate on specific categories of mail without having to have a permit and without needing walk sequence numbers. It is limited in some ways in that you cannot do letter or letter card size pieces. It does have to be flats only. Saturation mail can be letter size. EDDM is a rate they only offer for flat size mail. Also, in addition, saturation, you will normally have names, and EDDM will just say postal customer or have no name at all, so it's not quite as personal. EDDM normally requires city, state, zip code, but no address, so there have been instances where it's not as deliverable or some pieces can be returned. Next, I'd like to show you, we'll go real quickly through the same thing we just did but we'll do it in the software. Just a second here. And again, we'll open the file. And we have to make sure walk sequence is mapped. or it wouldn't even try for that special category. So under the pre-sort options, we can tab walk sequence. Carrier route. Walk sequence is a carrier route based pre-sort. So generally speaking, the walk sequence numbers reset for each carrier route, and it's the sequential order that the postal carrier will actually be walking and the addresses that they come to in that order. This is a saturation list, so you can see it's almost every single address on the street. And when we pre-sort a list like this, standard, we can do letter card, flats only if you're doing EDDM, but of course you can do saturation in both categories, letter card being the cheaper. And again, you can see it's now going to try for the cheapest rates, the saturation rates first, and only go to the lower categories if there's anything left over at that point. The software pre-sorts by zip code, but it's also using the walk sequence number, and you can see all of these have qualified for the SCF discount. And these, while they didn't qualify for the SCF, still got walk sequence high density line of travel rates. And again, the first page of the report is the totals, but if you scroll down to the lower pages, you'll see the per piece rates. These are automation categories, but saturation and high density are all enhanced carrier route categories. So part C for carrier route letters, you can see 20 cents saturation for the pieces with no discount, but the pieces that qualified for the SCF have gone down now to 15 cents. So a substantial discount even over the lowest possible rates of saturation. And real quickly before we close this, the tray and sack containers, where you can see walk sequence high density, walk sequence saturation. These are all automatically produced by the software. And in our software, anytime you run a pre-sort, it will ask you if you want to save it as a template. You of course can, so you could build up jobs if you do them regularly, if you have the same job time after time. Not sure why it's flickering, but it's a bit odd.
All right, thanks, Tony. Now we're moving on to the question and answer section of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please type them in now. I noticed we had a few coming in during the presentation, so we'll get to those. I also had a few questions asking if this webinar is recorded, and yes, it is being recorded, and I'll be able to send out a link tomorrow to this presentation. Okay, let's get right to it. Go ahead and type your questions in now. Okay, one of our first questions is, how about targeting high building condos? We send 400 plus mailing to each condo.
I'm assuming that would be able to be a saturation mailing. You could definitely, as long as you're meeting those minimum percentages. If it's condos, of course, that's residential, so you would have to be mailing to 90% of the addresses on that particular carrier route. So it might be not just the one building, but several others.
Another question is, what about nonprofits?
Yes, nonprofits as well. We can select nonprofit or profit for the rate schedule, and there are lower rates for nonprofits, even in saturation. Then they can go down as low as 10 or 11 cents, I believe.
Oh, okay, another one. Do you have any additional information in the record other than standard walk sequence info? Like age and income, etc.?
I think that question might be related to the list department. If you're asking about being able to produce lists or pull walk sequence files that reflect those demographics, that if that's the case, yeah, you can definitely do that, but you still have to meet those minimums or you can't claim the lowest possible rates. As long as you have at least 75% of all deliveries or 90% if it's only residential. That's the same.
Another one is we are targeting 3 to 4 high-rise condos in one zip code.
Oh, I think that applies to the previous question about the condos. It all has to do with the zip code and then the carrier route. So as long as you meet the minimums for the carrier's route, that's really all that it goes by. You'd have to have the 75% or 90% of that one carrier route that those high rises are within. Usually there will be more than one building in a carrier route.
Another question is how do I get started?
How to get started with mailing or saturation mailing in general? Saturation mail, the best way would probably be to look into just purchasing the leads unless you already have your own file. If you have your own file already, you could request a demo copy of our software and you could use that to determine if you could have that walk sequenced, or you can purchase a walk sequence list and request a demo of the software, and that would be all you'd need to get started, other than having a permit with the post office, of course.
Here's a big question. Are there any statistics on response rate of saturation mail versus EDDM? Since saturation is personalized with customer name, hopefully saturation has a better response rate.
I don't know that I have that I would know that off the top of my head, that we may be able to research that. I would feel the same. I'd be inclined to think the same thing. When the name is on the piece, you're more likely to look at it. Though, of course, it's one of those things where if you're in the market for a thing, you'll notice it, and if you're not in the market for a thing, you might not. It is true that saturation mail, normally 60 to 70% of the records will have a name, where EDDM will not have that. So it does seem more generic.
How much is walk sequence software?
Well, there really is no such thing as walk sequence software. Our software, Mailers Plus 4, can qualify you for those rates if you have a walk sequenced list, but the USPS does not give out a license for any software to do the walk sequencing. We have a department at Melissa Data that's always been licensed to do data enhancement, the Data Enhancement Services Department. They're licensed to do walk sequencing, or it's also known as the DSF2 append. Other than that, you either have to go through the USPS or someone licensed by the USPS to do that sequencing. You have to purchase a list in walk sequence or use a licensed provider to walk sequence your file.
We have many other questions regarding missing the first part of the webinar. Yes, I will provide a recording to this webinar. We also had another question regarding listening to our past webinars from the Mail Smarter series, and I will include a link to a landing page that has the links to those on-demand recordings that we had in the past. So yes, you'll be able to access all of that in the email I send you tomorrow. We still have a little bit of time, so if anyone has any other questions, please type them in now. Okay, it looks like there are no more questions. Thank you so much for attending our webinar. We'll have another webinar next month called How Palletizing High Volume Mailings Helps You Save Time and Money, and that will be on April 20th. It's a part of our Mail Smarter webinar series. For more info, go to www.melissadata.com. Have a great day, and thank you again for joining our webinar. Bye.